it'll be a bit of a stream of consciousness thing. I'll talk about what is on technology and what it means in business and overall larger issues of governance. I think the big thing which is happening today, which is very obvious to all of you, is that the technology has now been more ubiquitous. If you look at the history of technology, the time that I took Sonia and all to ACC was the time of gigantic mainframes, and then we had the mini computers, and then we had PCs. But the big thing is the smartphone, and as you know, the smartphone is growing at a very rapid pace. India alone has more than 100 million smartphones, expected to cross 500 million by 2020. So that's one thing, which is the arrival of smartphones, which are hugely powerful computers in your hand. But on the other side, equally, the fact that computers become cheaper, faster, better, and they've been doing that every 2 years by doubling in capacity, means that you have almost infinite capacity to keep things on the cloud, as they call it. So you have an Amazon cloud, or you have a Google cloud, or you have a Facebook cloud, and it can store any amount of information, anything you have, photographs, videos, and so on. And that is becoming cheaper and cheaper. In other words, becoming more and more free to keep all this information on the cloud. And the third big thing which is happening, which is related, is ubiquitous connectivity, which means that everybody is connected to the grid, and ultimately more and more through broadband. Mobile connections in India already are about 160 million, again going to go to about 400 million in the next 3 to 4 years. So think of this world where there's infinite capacity to store things and compute things, which is on the cloud. Infinite bandwidth, in other words, so much bandwidth that you can watch video, movies, or do whatever you want. And a very, very powerful thing in your hand, which is this computer, which is more powerful than the computer in Apollo 11. So you have this new environment which is emerging. And this environment is having a huge impact on every aspect of our lives, whether it's on business, our social lives, on our governance, and so on. Take an example of media. Media has got affected by technology in two ways. In the first level, media has basically got two parts to the business, right? There's the way media makes revenue, which is primarily through advertising, and there's the part which is about journalists and articles and so forth. Now, the first impact of the technology was on the advertising, the rise of internet, Google search, classified ads. So more and more advertising started moving out of newspapers and started moving to online world, and you could see the steady decline in revenues of all kinds of publications. And you end up with a situation where Washington Post, which is one of the most storied brands in media, was sold for a few $100 million to Jeff Bezos, whose Amazon is worth $300 billion. Similarly, the New York Times is worth less than $1 billion, whereas WhatsApp is worth $19 billion. So suddenly you have the whole change in value and power structure, where the media has lost out, first because of the advertising going away. But the equally important thing which is happening to media is that the journalists are also getting disintermediated. Because today with new media, you can reach a person directly. You keep seeing tweets from Harsha and Anita and all that, with the articles and so on. So basically, I no longer need to, you can get information directly from Facebook or Flipboard or from Twitter, and the journalist also, in some sense, is getting disintermediated. And that is something that's happening in India. If you look at the whole way the Modi campaign was run, it was never done through giving interviews to television. It was done by using new media to reach out to all the voters. So media is one example of how this ubiquitous rise in technology has both disintermediated the revenue side of the business, which is advertising, as well as the business of the editorial side, which is journalism. But this is not the only industry which this is happening. You can see what's happening in taxis. I mean, we have all heard of the whole Uber controversy. Now, Uber is what does Uber do? Uber it's not a taxi company. Uber is just a company which matches people who have cars to spare with people who want to take rides. It only acts as a matching between these two categories of people, because the guy with the car has a smartphone, the guy who wants the car has a smartphone. And if you have a car, if you're driving a car and you want to rent it out, you just log on to Uber and become a driver with them, and then you go into the computer system, and if the other person is a passenger, just wants to take a taxi from here to Nariman Point, he just pulls up Uber on his phone, and he checks where he asks for a taxi, and there'll be some 3 more of them roaming around. He'll see them on a map, he'll select one, the guy will come in 5 minutes, he takes the ride, and you just get off because automatically your account gets debited to your credit card. Now this is a very simple thing, but it's possible because of what? Because both the driver and the passenger have a smartphone, because now you have maps, so everybody knows exactly where you are. You have online payment systems, so payments get automated. So all these things have suddenly made Uber possible, and Uber is now worth $17 billion, which is much more than Hertz or Avis were ever worth. The same thing is happening in hotels with Airbnb. Airbnb again is not a hotel. It just again matches people who have rooms to spare with people who want rooms. And today, within 3-4 years, Airbnb is the world's largest hotel chain. It has more rooms than Hyatt or Marriott or anyone. And in New York City alone, 10% of the rooms rented are from Airbnb. And that's worth another $15 billion. So this is all happening because, so what we're saying is it's not just that the technology is spreading. Technology is affecting media. Technology is affecting the taxi or the transportation business. Technology is affecting the hotel business. Technology is affecting the payments business. If you, for example, the way to know how payments happen in the world, if you have a bank today, when you make a payment, you use a debit card or a credit card. So you take your debit card, you go to an ATM, you swipe it on your ATM, and the ATM gives the money. But now with things like Apple Pay, you don't need any of these things. You just have your iPhone, you put your finger on the biometric reader, and it automatically buys what you want to buy. And that is going to have a dramatic impact on payment industry. So take industry after industry. They're getting completely usurped, and old players are getting affected, and new players are changing very rapidly. Now there's something similar we did with the Aadhaar project, because the mandate that we had was to give a unique ID to every Indian resident. Now one way to think about it was just to somehow figure out a way to give IDs to everyone. But we said that if you're designing a system in the 21st century, let's make it a digital ID, an ID which is online, an ID which is on the cloud. So this is a fairly radical idea 5 years back. But we said this is the future of identity, that having a digital identity is the way to go. So we built a system which not only gave somebody a number, it gave a way to verify that number online with your finger or with your eye. And therefore anyone with an Aadhaar number can do an online verification of their finger or eye somewhere, anywhere they are, wherever there's a small device. And today, the number of people with Aadhaar in India has crossed 675 million, and it will cross about 1 billion by next year. And every one of them can then use the identity online to verify the ID, to buy things, to do anything that they want online where identity is important. So this again is something which is built like a platform. And that is the other big thing which is happening in the world today, that when you think about solving a problem, in the old days you thought of building a large vertically integrated company. You build an IBM or you build a GE. But today you don't think of building large big companies. You think of creating platforms which allow many people to come together to solve a problem or create a business. If you look at the government space, the biggest example of a platform is the internet. The internet today, the cumulative market cap of internet companies would be excess of $1 trillion. But the internet was not really designed for business. If you look at the history of the internet, it was really designed to solve security problems. They wanted a secure way for communication in the US defense. And that's how the internet was born. But when the internet started using initially for these purposes, later on, it was somebody invented something called the World Wide Web, this www.x.quadrum.com kind of thing. And then somebody else invented the Mosaic, the internet browser, which became Netscape, which then led to the Internet Explorer. And then you had all these companies like Facebook, Google and all coming. So over 30 years, Internet went from a technology for defense to the world's biggest innovation platform. This is an example of an ecosystem, because anybody who writes to the Internet writes to a global audience. Another example of ecosystem is GPS, or Global Positioning Systems. GPS again began as a US defense project. The idea was, in the height of the Star Wars between the US and the Soviets, they wanted a very, very precise way of attacking targets. They had to program the missile exactly with the latitude and longitude of a target. And so they built this huge infrastructure of rotating geostationary satellites which could triangulate and get every point on Earth. So it was originally a defense use, but sometime in the year 2000, GPS was put in the commercial domain, allowing private people to use the GPS to build applications. And today the GPS economy is also worth maybe $500 billion, because there's Google Maps, inertial navigating systems, location-based services, self-driving cars, Uber, all of them use GPS to figure out how the maps and where you are. Again, an example of where an ecosystem was created which led to all this innovation. So even with the Aadhaar project, our ultimate goal was to create an innovation platform that lots and lots of entrepreneurs will build applications that will then use Aadhaar for verification for all kinds of applications. And you may wonder, what are these applications? I'll give one example which I had never dreamt of. Somebody came to us and said, we want to make Thane a bicycle zone. In other words, reduce the number of cars, everybody goes around on bicycles. Yeah, sounds good. The problem they had was that even if they had the bicycles, how to make sure the bicycles remain in Thane, nobody steals them and takes them somewhere else. So they said, why not have a check-in system where when I take a bicycle from one part of Thane, I give my Aadhaar number and authenticate, and when I return it at the other end, I authenticate and release it. That way the inventory of cycles will remain in Thane. Now, that's a good example of how you use identity verification for solving the problem of having a good bicycle management system in a city. So these are the kind of applications that we see emerging on Aadhaar. Similarly, the Apple ecosystem is an ecosystem. You have iTunes and iPhone and iPad and iWatch or whatever. Google is an ecosystem. Facebook is an ecosystem. So the future is really designing things as ecosystems. So companies which today want to be successful either have to be a participant in some ecosystem or create an ecosystem where they bring other people to participate. And to me, that's one of the big changes that's happening in the business world. The notion of ecosystems, the notion that you build platforms, the notion that you encourage other people to come and work on these platforms. And part of the reason is that you cannot bring all innovation into your organization. You have to create an approach or a strategy where other people can contribute to participating and being on your platform. So that's again the big change, and I think in the next year you'll see more and more of these ecosystems emerging. And then one more example of what's happening, which is very important, is the impact of the smartphone on technological revolution. And the reason for this is that the smartphone is a consumer device which, when it is launched, ships in millions. So if a particular component, electronic component, goes into a smartphone, automatically its price drops to less than $10, because the smartphone itself has to cost less than $100. So whether it's the screen, whether it's the fingerprint reader, the gyrometer, the accelerometer, the graphic chip, whatever, the battery, whatever the piece of the smartphone, the price of that will be less than $10. So the moment a component becomes inside a phone, the prices crash. What that has done is now created a whole class of components that can be reconfigured into other devices. For example, you have now robots which will cost a few $100 because you can make a lot of the robots with smartphone chips. Or you can have 3D printers which allow you to print things in 3D. You can get them for $500 because most of the components inside come from smartphone. You now have nano satellites which are much, much smaller and more compact than these gigantic satellites launched by NASA or ISRO, which again are made with smartphone parts. So what is happening? The smartphone revolution of creating commodity chips is creating all these spin-off effects where I can design you can design a drone for $400 using these smartphone chips. Suddenly everything is now reaching very, very affordable price points because all these parts are now available off the shelf for a few dollars. So I think the innovation that's going to happen, the combination of the software revolution that I talked about and the revolution of hardware and these chips is allowing people to create all kinds of new products and services that will have a huge impact. So I think this is just what's happening on technology and business. Obviously, this has a huge impact on governance because it creates huge amount of information, a huge amount of transparency, accountability, allows people to participate in government. I mean, if you look at what we did in the Aadhaar project alone, India spends about 300,000 crores on subsidies and entitlements, 300,000 crores a year. LPG alone is 40,000 crores. And we estimated that something like 10 to 40% of that is waste because it's hijacked, it goes to the wrong people, it goes to ghosts and duplicate people who don't exist. And our estimate was that just by using Aadhaar to eliminate ghosts and duplicates in the list of beneficiaries, we can save up to 50,000 crores a year of government expenditure just by removing the wastage in the system. So that is a good example of how you can use this new technology for actually having a financial benefit to the public budget by having this efficiency. Another example of how it can help in corruption is that today when a government benefit flows to an individual, they have to collect it only from one point, from one bureaucrat. And that leads to corruption because that person can then not give that benefit. And therefore, if you can create a model where the benefit goes with your identity anywhere, you can go and get your money out of a bank account, then the bargaining power shifts to the consumer because he now has choice as to where he goes to withdraw his money. So these are all small things, but these things have a huge impact on the way that people's lives are led. Now obviously, this puts a huge pressure on the system because the system is not able to cope with this pace of innovation. So the big challenge we have is governments by nature are reactive, governments by nature are stable, they don't want change, they want maintenance. And innovation is now accelerating on the other side. And this innovation, rapid innovation meeting a rigid system creates all kinds of conflict. And we see that conflict whether it's Amazon having to pay sales tax or Uber requiring two-factor authentication or Survey of India filing a case against Google Maps. All these are examples of the tension that happens when you have a regulatory and legal system which is not designed for this new era of innovation. And you'll keep seeing this kind of friction between the two. So I think that this is just, there are many things happening, but I just thought I'd stick to these things, what's happening to technology, what's happening on business models thanks to technology, what is the impact of that on many social things, and how we are really at a very exciting time where huge problems of healthcare, of education, of sanitation, all these can be addressed using technology in a more fundamental way. So I'm very optimistic about the future, and I believe these are some of the next few big things. Thank you very much.
From some of the things that he said to talk really on society, he's left that space a bit to me. He has lots more to say, so during the questions perhaps you can draw him out a little more. I think bang on, he talked about all the trends. We've been traveling around a bit out of curiosity to see what are the new emerging trends around the world. And if you see the world, you can really divide it up into countries like ours, where half the population or more is really almost in the 19th or certainly the 20th century in terms of their lifestyles and their consumption patterns. And then you see this very developed world, and some of us here belong to that world too, where we've almost finished our journey of accumulation and consumption to some extent. So you're seeing in the post-accumulation, post-consumption societies, what are the new things that are emerging? So that interests me because in some sense, if you look at India's past history, we were already there, and I don't want to glorify that too much, but it's nice to see now all the new thinking. So here, while in India and China we are so concerned about accelerating GDP and growth, in Europe and some parts of America they are talking about sustainable degrowth. So when you see these two humps, it's very interesting to see what social things emerge from there. So what Nandan was talking about, the collaborative consumption model or the shared economies, are about a world in which you understand that there are limited resources and they need to go around more. So you innovate, you use all the technology trends that Nandan is talking about to make a world that's better for all. One of my friends called Adam Werbach, who's one of the youngest environmentalists who worked with corporates, many big corporates to drive their sustainability work, has set up something called Yerdle. It's just set up, but it's already picking up very quickly. The idea behind Yerdle is that people like us always have a lot of excess stuff lying around. And there are other people who need to have that excess stuff, that same stuff. And normally they'll go out and buy it. So imagine the footprint of that thing on the world, right? Instead of that, he set up a platform, again to Nandan's point, everything, if you build a platform, so many people can do their individual plug and play if there's a robust platform. So on Yerdle, people who have extra things lying around, offer them up, and people who want those things get them, but there is no money involved. There's no monetary transaction. Instead, you get credits. And then you begin to use those credits in different creative ways in the community. You can exchange babysitting services, for example. So they're going into a post-money world. Not everybody, and I'm not saying it's going to happen tomorrow, but it's interesting to imagine the future like that. Collaborative consumption, he already gave you examples of Airbnb. Instead of building new hotel rooms, you use existing real estate. Instead of having 1 million new cars, you use the extra time on individual cars, which become then public transport. So I see that as a big trend. We did a small example of that in Pratham Books because we created a platform where instead we put out all our books in the Creative Commons. That's another big and growing movement in the world. Instead of all IP being locked into and creating value only for your organization and your shareholders, what are the possibilities of opening it out to the world? So in Pratham Books, all our books are put up on the Creative Commons, which means they're free for anybody to take, to reuse, to retell, to remix, to use the graphics and add their own text, to use the text and add their own graphics, to share, to download, to translate, and even to sell. Because ours was a societal mission. The minute you take greed off of the table and you think of projects as something that are societally beneficial, it allows you to create in ways that you would not if you had to narrowly look at the first bottom line and only your shareholders. So through that, we would never have been able to create a distribution platform if we had gone the normal route. Because we put this all up, today our books are all around the world. We don't even know where they've gone. We get surprised every time someone writes to us and says it's translated into Chinese, Japanese, all the African languages, it's gone to Latin America. Because we put this up for people to access, and thanks to the internet, thanks to the Creative Commons, you're really able to make impact that you could not have in the old models. So I think some of the trends are that you will not lock everything into IP. Of course, a lot of things will happen in the old way, in the good way, and that has produced a lot of value. So I'm not a knee-jerk left-wing ideologue, but I'm saying that there are other possibilities. Today's paper or yesterday's, a new TB drug. Pharmaceutical companies have been trying very hard to produce TB drugs because resistant TB strains are showing up, and India is the capital of resistant TB. How are we going to get a drug? Have you all heard of a common platform, open source platform for drug discovery? Just think of that. Now in the last few years, it sounds funny. Why would a company or individuals create drugs and only keep the economic benefit for themselves? 300 years ago, it would have seemed through Ayurveda that you just didn't do that. You shared benefits. Those ideas are coming back, and open source drug discovery means that no one entity will have the IP on those drugs, and other people, of course, those who produce it will make some economic benefit, but you don't lock up all value inside your private space. I think that is a trend. I think it's going to increase, and I hope later Nandan can also share some examples of that sort of thing. So the other thing I see is that 3 billion people will be digital citizens. So that's a whole different way of looking at life. You're born connected. I won't be surprised if wearable technology allows you to have wearable technology in the fetus itself. And they're beginning to map a lot of things inside the womb. So I don't know where all that will take us. But digital citizens, they are born. My little 2-year-old granddaughter is so comfortable with the iPad that her grandmother, my sister, thinks she's smarter than her. Which is not true. But it's just that they're so comfortable with technology. Imagine 3 billion digital citizens who are able with their little devices, one on their bodies or in their hands, who can talk to anybody else in the world anytime they want. What possibilities emerge from that? It can go both ways because it allows people also, the world is at your fingertips, but you can stay locked inside your bubble. So you never know, there are always opposing trends I see. So I see one trend where people collaborate like crazy because it's so much easier to collaborate, but it also, that same technology allows you to lock yourself down and not know who your neighbor is. You may be worried about some grandmother in Latin America because she and you share some interest, but you won't have a clue of what's happening outside your door. So these are the trends that you also have to watch out for, because the same things that bring benefit to society also have the other side. So look at how the rise of individualism, right? So that's one trend you can say is both positive and negative. Similarly, the rise of fundamentalism. I think that's a new thing that you have to look at in societies today. Many societies are turning more and more right-wing, both in Europe, across the Middle East. At the same time that you saw the Arab uprising, you're now seeing the specter of ISIS. So both, I see two contradictory things all happening in the world at the same time. And they are driven and fueled by the technological revolution that Kandan was just describing to you. So similarly, while you see religious fundamentalism growing, you see this whole new breed of new spirituality movements all around the world, where people are connecting with ancient religions, ancient spiritualism practices, and reimagining them for today's world. At your fingertips today, you can get lessons in Buddhism, Chinese meditation, Japanese, kind of techniques. You have all sorts of gurus who are using the latest understanding of neuroscience and human behavior to help you become happier. Happiness is the next new big thing. We all have to be happy or else. So there are a lot of interesting things. I believe that socially also trends that are happening, which we can look out for and discuss more as you like. And but at the same time, when we come back to India, I always feel that we must not forget that half our population is still waiting for the basics. So those of us who can must use whatever trends Nandan spoke about, build ecosystems, whatever it takes. But we cannot have a world where half of people are ahead and half are left so much behind. It's simply not sustainable, especially today when everything is so connected to everything else. So I see it as a huge opportunity for all of us with all these new technological developments to use technology for society. Otherwise, history has taught us enough times that it can go horribly wrong. But that's why we are here. That's why we're here to look at future trends and do whatever each one of us can. Because in the end, we all know we are all connected. So thank you very much.
One of the advantages of being a host for an event like this is you get to ask the first question. So, and that too in a bicentenary environment. So, please feel free to ask the question. I have a very simple question, actually two. With this, what you're talking about, Nandan, for entrepreneurs, I want to ask you, how do we make money? I think all of us would like to know that.
Ask Abhay.
Ask Abhay. And the second, knowing that Rohini, you were one of the pioneers of philanthropy in the country, and I know that you're not just a philanthropist yourself, but you're encouraging others. So my second question is, once Nandan tells us how to make money, I want you to tell us how do we give it away. So,
Well, I because there are so many trends that are happening. If you have the instinct for figuring out which of these trends are converging in a way that a sustainable business is possible, I think there's lots of stuff that can happen, because every industry is getting disrupted, every business model is getting disrupted, every delivery channel is getting disrupted. Many products are getting obsoleted at a very rapid pace. So when you have that kind of chaos, if you can spot the right opportunity, I think there's lots of money to be made. Now, for example, one of the projects that we're looking at now is how to address the challenge of applied literacy and numeracy. You know, Rohini, as you know, has been working in this space for many years. She was original big supporter of Pratham book she chaired, and she funded the Asar report and all that. And the reality in this country today is that we have few 100 million children who can't read or write or do basic arithmetic. Now, if there's a way to fix that using all these tools, you can create lots of both non-profit and business opportunities around that. So I think healthcare is going to change dramatically. I think the whole, you know, with all this wearable computing and all that, you're going to have hundreds and hundreds of healthcare solutions that will be off the mobile phone, on your wristwatch, on your headband, on your Fitbit, whatever. So everywhere I look, I see opportunity. Except that you know, I don't feel like starting a company because I'm probably too old to start a company. But I think it's a great time to be an entrepreneur.
Yeah, I think it's a great time to give money away. I think the sooner we start, the better. We can't wait till we're 80 years old and say, okay, I'm done with my own consumption patterns, now let me give it away. I think it's great fun to get money, and of course you have to look after yourself and your family first. But many of us have excess money that we can think of differently. So instead of saying I'll do the next entertainment thing for myself or the next whatever, I think you can include that in your own strategy for your personal happiness. Because again, I'll go back to neuroscience. You know, they will tell you that we are wired for altruism, and that altruism gives us joy, and that you're just like after a nice run, your dopamine and all your nice neurotransmitters release all these wonderful chemicals which make you feel happy. So the joy of giving, in whichever way you can, it not be money, it can be time, because time is money too. The sooner you start, there's enough and more opportunity, because just like we were talking earlier, the big trend, all the old power structures are getting undermined in 100 ways across all technologies, across all industries, across all spaces, whether it's healthcare, whether it's education, whether it's media, whether it's, you know, anywhere you look. So there are many innovative entrepreneurs there who also, social entrepreneurs, who also need support. And eventually you could get back by giving, not necessarily just from the neurotransmitters, but if you invest in social impact companies, you could eventually make money too. You could combine the two things. I think this is a great time to start philanthropy in innovative ways as young as you can. Don't wait, because there are many, many people waiting behind us. And in some sense, it's a glass bowl, and look at the number of people whose noses are pressed, and we are inside the glass bowl and they are outside. I think it's time to break those walls. And the only way we can do it, start young, take any cause you like, anything at all. There's 100 ways to do it today, so creatively. Things like change.org. One man sitting in California whom we met just said, why not create a platform to start petitions so that people start getting interested in one issue, come together and make change happen. I mean, there are 100 ideas floating that just need a bit of support. You can still continue to get your with your day jobs, you can still continue to do all the things that you do, but make that special, precious time, which will also be time for yourselves.
We want to know, I want to know, of course you're saying you should give. When did you really start, and how did you start? What was your journey? You know, a lot of people have excess money, but they don't give it. So, you know, not necessarily if you have it, you give it. So what's the mindset that you had, which we can learn?
Again, like, no matter what, I would have done something if I didn't become, Nandan says he's an accidental entrepreneur. Thanks to him being a successful accidental entrepreneur, I have become an accidental philanthropist. But otherwise also I'm sure we both would have done something, because to us the social challenges are the biggest and most complex and therefore the most interesting to participate in helping solve. So I think we would have done something anyway. I guess I just learned by doing. So started small, tried a few things, became comfortable with doing some things, and today I suppose the first phase was just giving randomly, then getting more strategic, doing education, then water and sanitation, and now my third phase of philanthropy. In some sense, I'm supporting all people and institutions that are involved in bettering governance and independence media and environmental issues. So third phase of philanthropy, you just keep doing and you keep learning from a lot of people outside who are doing so much good work. Nandan, will you add to that?
Also, you were saying that when you got a lot of money from the ADR, you felt that you had to give it away.
Yeah, and I also truly believe that in societies will not allow runaway wealth creation of individuals unless the wealthy use that wealth responsibility for social good. It can happen for some time, it cannot stay for too long. Public pressure will build up. Why does government allow us to have such fantastic taxation rates? I mean, many people disagree with me, but I think a top 30% rate is extremely reasonable, and it used to be 80% when I was tiny. So that is much better than that. Why would governments do that? Because they hope that those who make that money and keep that excess will use it for social good better than how government would have used it if they had taxed that money. There is true responsibility that comes with wealth and wealth creation. And I think, so that's why I feel very strongly committed that this money is held in trust. We have a long culture of holding wealth in trust. And both Nandan and I feel very strongly that we have that responsibility and we must execute it. You want to add something?
No.
The space, because he is also a philanthropist in many ways. So, you want to go first?
No, I mean, for example, a lot of the philanthropy that I do is in education, because I believe that human capital or people are really the thing that keeps societies going. And initially, I was doing a lot of work in higher education. One of the things I did was co-funded a 1,000-room hospital in IIT Bombay, because I said that you have these millions of kids trying to get into IIT, and they're not taking more students only because there are no hostel rooms. So we built a 1,000-room hostel about 15 years back, and that essentially took the IIT capacity from 2,000 to 3,000 students. That means that many more bright kids are getting opportunity. So that's one kind of leverage that you have. Similarly, we are funding a new institute for urbanization, because we think that India's biggest challenge in the next 30-40 years is going to be urbanization. India today has about 300 million people living in cities, and you know the state of our cities. And by 2030 or so, we'll have 600-700 million people living in cities. So unless you can build sustainable cities, this is not going to be stable. So we thought, unless we have people who understand sustainable urbanization in the future, you won't be able to get there. And therefore, we are funding a university for urbanization. So strategic in the sense, look at things where there's a multiplier effect that you can bring on different challenges and provide funding for that.
Yeah, in some sense, you have to do root cause analysis. I mean, I can keep on feeding hungry people or whatever, and it will never end. I can keep on giving support to people who are in need. But unless we start looking at why on earth that is in many societies have succeeded in getting most of their people out of poverty or created enough public infrastructure so that you don't need individual private infrastructure, good roads, electricity, good water resources. So if we do some root cause analysis in any of the fields that we are interested and support the alleviation of those things that have gone wrong there, I'll take water resources. And I can put a lot of money giving people water filters or taps or pipes. Will that solve the problem? No. Because unless we start looking at the water resource, whether it's the aquifer or the lake or the open well or the river, and say why, if you want to clean the Ganga, you have to start with the Gangotri. So if we don't do that in our philanthropy, you will only be doing band-aid solutions. And I'm not saying it's bad to give money to someone in need. Of course we should do that as part of our human connection with someone who's suffering. But if you want to do this seriously, you have to look at the root causes and try to address the imbalance of power as well. A lot of this happens because power is unevenly distributed in society. So I believe a lot of our work is also political in nature. Political in the best sense of the word political. It is about changing the balance of unequal power. So if more people had voice to become part of their own solution, rather than just look like a problem, you are changing the dynamics of the Samaj. And I think that's the kind of work that many philanthropists did in America and other places, Europe especially, for those societies to be as they are today.
I see that all of this platform creation is taking care of information, it's taking care of processing, it's taking care of so many other things. But it's not taking care of making it possible for me, for example, to make my own product, because it's easy for me to have my raw material delivered to me in a more facile way. That's one issue that
what do you mean by that?
Physical issue of being able to distribute effectively. For example, take Jammu and Kashmir. They need shawls, they need blankets, they need something to keep them warm. We know that there is a huge supply of all of that available everywhere. We just have not linked the distribution to make sure it gets there.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that a lot of innovative thinking is happening.
Yeah, no,
In government processes, so much money is available. We raise, even at what Rohini calls good rates of tax, massive sums of money every year in lakhs of crores. The difficulty seems to be that all of that money is not well spent. So is there a way to collaborate to make sure that this spending happens better?
sure. One, it spends money on paying interest on its debt, which is really a function. If you have low inflation, you can have low interest, you can cut that, but that's a macroeconomic thing. It spends money on defense. It spends huge amount of money on salaries and pensions. The pension bill of the central government for retired civil servants, military officers and railway officers is 87,000 crores a year. So when you look at the money spent on defense, on interest payments and salaries and pensions, that itself is a huge part of the expenditure. The balance money is really spent partly on infrastructure, where efficiency will come obviously from better project management and cutting time in building roads or ports and all that. And then on entitlements and subsidies. Our entitlement subsidy bill is about 300,000 crores a year. There's a huge role for efficiency, and that's where the Aadhaar and all that work. So converting everything to cash transfers and then directly crediting money into the bank account electronically will dramatically cut the efficiency. Another big area is procurement. Procurement runs into 100,000, 200,000 crores. We don't have proper procurement system. There are no, procurement is an art. It is science. People have procurement tools. So that's broadly on the expenditure side. On the revenue side, I think taxation is a huge opportunity. I think you're a guru of that. But I'll give you two examples. We don't have a unified way of identifying taxpayers. So the way central government identifies taxpayers is with the PAN ID. State governments don't use the PAN ID. So there's a lot of tax leakage because the way the guy files their service tax to the center is different from the VAT return in the state, because he knows that you can't match these two things. Or your corporate affairs guys don't take the PAN number for shareholders, so you can't match shareholder list with taxpayers. So basic reforms of that kind can have a huge impact on the revenue side. So there's a lot of scope for improvement. And then on the expenditure side, you can really create a real-time expenditure portal where you as a citizen should be able to go and see every rupee spent. You can do that in real time today. It's not a big deal. But this also means breaking down huge amounts of interest, which don't necessarily want those kind of systems. Part of mission is information asymmetry, but part of it is physical assets, warehouses, roads, transportation systems, and so forth. I think a lot can be done here, but for example, one of the projects that I worked on was creating an electronic tolling system for the whole country, which I think will now start happening. Because what happens is every state has different taxation and different laws. So every time a truck is moving from Maharashtra to Karnataka, it encounters this barrier. You can automate that whole thing and the guy can go streamline. Or toll roads. Toll road is a big problem here, your MNS guys broke it down and all. So that whole thing can be streamlined. So there's lots of stuff you can do. I think the good news is there's lots of things in India that you can make more efficient.
You want to talk about the 3D printing and all that stuff and how the distribution chain itself will get...
Yeah, and I think distribution will change. I mean, you see, again, if you look at old retailing model, right? You build a gigantic thing, you build a Walmart or a Tesco or somebody like that. But tomorrow's retailing is aggregation of 10,000 small shops who will use information and get supplies, but they each will be an individual small entrepreneur. But he'll use the power of information to create a aggregation to buy in bulk and all that. Or what's happening in manufacturing. I mean, today, for example, you have places where you can go and have a Xerox done. Tomorrow you'll have a chain of 3D printing outlets where I can get parts done, or suppose you can make a small tractor in the village by just downloading design from the web. So I think all those kind of things are, I mean, they're not very far away. In the next 5 years, you're going to see those happening.
Really, with all the talk that we do about innovation in technology, innovation in the digital space, innovation in the computing space, I sometimes get the feeling that it's taking away all the intellectual capital of society in India in particular into one direction. Is it that we are also losing out in the process, or on the flip side, of innovation in non-technology or non-digital or non-internet areas like physical sciences or social sciences, by drawing the intellectual capital of the pool into one direction, because everybody is attracted, because the rate of change is so fast and it's quote-unquote easy to innovate there. So
actually, I would have agreed with that thesis about 10 years back. I think 10 years back, everybody wanted to be a software guy. The reason why I think it has changed, one is, in some sense, because India didn't reform its higher education system. In the last 10 years, there is a significant migration of young students abroad, right? We have 80 to 100,000 students out of India. And most of them actually are not doing software, they're doing liberal arts and those kind of things. So I think I see a lot more people today, young people in social sciences and economics and history and philosophy than ever before. So I think, while yes, some people are getting wrong, I think we are getting a large number of people in these sciences. The other thing is that tomorrow's innovation is at the intersection of physical and information. It's no longer just software, it's about, today it's a product. A product is physical and there is software in it, right? Like you have a thermostat like Nest, which is a smart thermostat. A thermostat is a device that controls temperature, but it's also a completely software-driven thing, which allows you to know exactly from, you know what's happening in your home and so on. And now with this so-called Internet of Things, where every device will be IP enabled, it's the intersection of the physical world with the information world. So I think some balance is coming back.
We did a quick dipstick, and many of the youngsters who are going in now, we found to our surprise, are going to the physical sciences and mechanical engineering. And I think education curriculum will change so that it will reflect what he's saying. The physical sciences, the social sciences, much more interdisciplinary. So you could get a degree in philosophy, physics and biotechnology or something, because that's where the innovation convergence is happening.
See, a big part of innovation is at the intersection of disciplines. Biology with information, information with materials, Internet of Things with sensors. It's at the intersection of disciplines.
Yeah, neurosciences.
Yeah, I did that.
Yeah. So, no, I just have a question to ask. While I agree that while I agree that education and technology are great levelers and a great opportunity for many segments of society to kind of improve their quality of life, what happens to people who can't get onto this bandwagon? Do you see a lot of segments of society, especially the older people, becoming obsolete in a sense? And unless you have inclusion, what happens to them? Now you expect everybody to do, even a passport form you have to have online, and you just get, more and more of that. So what happens to those who can't do it?
No, I think that people who have not grown up as digital natives and expecting them to become, that's not going to happen. And I think they probably will have intermediated solutions where people who know digital will use that to give them physical world solutions. The passport form they'll still print and give it to them and they'll fill it out. So that is the way I think that will evolve. But to me the bigger thing is the divergence of rich kids and poor kids.
Yeah, I wanted to ask that to Rohini. What happens to aspirations and the
No, I think it's very serious. As Rohini said, her grandniece, our grandniece. I don't want to admit that I have even a
So
grandniece.
you already said that before you started your business.
So he's 2 years old and can play sophisticated games on an iPad. At the same time, there is an 8-year-old child in a government school in a slum next to us who can't add a double-digit number. So this divergence actually is the scariest part, because the kids who are on the escalator are getting this fast escalator. The kids are off the escalator are getting, and to me that's the bigger problem. And that requires somehow to find a way to get these kids in bulk to come onto the escalator.
Yeah, and also on aging the demographics in the world, aging population on that side and a very young population on this side, and then artificial boundaries created that prevent the flow of young people to those areas where they are needed. So that's going to be a big challenge of migration and politics, the politics of migration and movement of
We
human
have
beings.
2 questions here from Nara and then Atul. I'll come back to you. Yeah, Nara.
Hi. The next big thing which you talked about, which creates a lot of value, one of them come out of US.
No.
For example, let's come one with the idea it creates $15 billion over 3 years in India. You don't see those type of valuation coming or ideas coming out of India. If you look at it, most of them come out and we try. Your Flipkart is a copy of an Amazon, but the Flipkart
There's
is
nothing wrong with that. If you can create $7 billion of value, that's good. I mean,
So those ideas that you talked about, most of them seem to originate there. Is it because the type of education system in India does not permit you or does not encourage you to do that? That's the first question. The second supplementary question or different type of question is, if you are and not an accidental entrepreneur but a willing entrepreneur, what is it that you will take up today as one which you like to build?
yeah. See, 3 trillion, so it's one step. The other is, entrepreneurship is, this is a more recent trend. People like us, Infosys, and then you have the whole cycles of innovation. So, I don't know, Abhay is probably better, but I don't know. I had not paid attention to innovation for the last 5 years, the government job. But the last 3-4 months I've been roaming around Bangalore and I'm amazed at what's happening. I think the number of startups, the number of ideas, not just tech ideas, all kind of ideas. It's like HSR layout, which is a suburb of a suburb. And if Koramangala is a suburb, HSR later a suburb of Koramangala, one road has got some 7 or 10 startups. So I think it's a very exciting time. I don't know what you feel. You're not that convinced, Abhay?
No, I think I'll just keep it short because I think one of the things which seems to be the focus is the market cap. And I think people are very confused about what market cap means. So for example, Flipkart's market cap of $7 billion is not for what they have done. It is because what they are doing is so efficient that between funding a Flipkart or a crossword, you want to give that money to Flipkart so that they can do it, they can grow that industry much more. So Flipkart has arguably promised their investors a certain thing. So if at all they don't deliver on that promise, this market cap can go to 7 million. Believe me, I've been in that situation very often. Okay, and I think so the point that Nandan is making is the market for ideas and the market of brave entrepreneurs is coming up because the problems are bigger and larger in this country. So if at all you have entrepreneurs going after bigger and larger problems, then you will have capitalists giving them enough money and they will get the market cap.
See, the thing is to like when we saw Infosys, all my relatives said, please take a job or go to New Jersey and work in Manhattan or something. So I think only now we see a lot more willingness of parents to have their children do entrepreneurship. The other thing is because the educational opportunities are so limited, you become risk averse. You study hard to get to IIT, you study hard to get to IIM. Why the hell will you take a risk and start a company? You'll go and join Hindustan Unilever. So I think we have to open it up a lot more for people to be willing to take the risk.
So, which is on these kind of internet-linked businesses, media has been highlighting these two high-value examples, 7 billion and whatever billion plus. But how do you see the overall scene, and where do you see opportunities of more internet-linked or e-commerce oriented businesses? Because we are just at the infancy of all this.
Yeah, no.
And what about today?
No, I think, for example, let's take, today India has 100 million smartphones, right? Let's say that by 2019 we'll have 500 million smartphones, which is a reasonable assumption. That's creating opportunities in every part of the food chain, right? So today, the fact that you're going to have 500 million smartphones has led to a Micromax, a Spice, a Lava, Canvas, all these guys. They're all creations of this opportunity. How do you make a smartphone today, right? You buy the design, Google gives the design, some Android one. Canvas or Micromax builds the thing. They go to China and get the thing designed or done. They go to Qualcomm or MediaTek and get the chips. They go to Facebook or they go to Flipkart or Snapdeal to sell it. This whole thing I can do in 2 months. So you're going to create these kind of rapid supply chains will create opportunities for people, or healthcare apps. I meet so many guys today. There's one guy I met who's building a diabetes strip, so you can check your diabetes. Another guy is building a thing for eyesight. You look at the eye and you can see the eyesight. A third guy is building something for blood samples. So you see suddenly a whole host of guys starting companies that are the intersection of this IT and health to build low-cost applications for doing diagnostic work that historically you would go to a lab or something. So that's going to create a whole set of innovation. So I mean, everywhere this thing is going to drive a change.
But see, today the big question is the viability of business, because whatever examples one sees around are the companies which may sound good, innovative, but they're making losses. And more than innovation, it seems the ability to keep raising money from friends like Abhay seems to be even more important, because you have to constantly keep funding it. And since you come from services background, IT service, and so do I, having seen business where you do only when there is profit and certain margin, then one wonders that when would these businesses become profitable, that you don't have to keep raising money.
I would find it difficult to run a bootstrap, generate profit, invest and all that. So this is a different model.
But is it a long gestation, or you think that turnaround could come sooner?
No, I mean, what is the theory? The theory is that at some point, this investment, you gain market share or you gain prime pole position in some sector, and then that pole position allows you to make profit in the future, right? That's one argument, the Amazon kind of argument. Or you create such a hot company that doesn't matter if you make any money, somebody will buy it for a bomb. That's the other argument. So, I mean, those are the logics that go into doing this.
What Anita was saying and what Sailesh started about this distribution, and then she was talking about this inequality, and Atul also mentioned this thing about the entrepreneurship thing. But as we were talking, and one was just thinking that right now at Retro, we're working on this whole model of e-fulfillment, where if the Amazons and the Flipkarts and all have to survive, this distribution, what you were saying, Sailesh, and in books, starting with our own small way, in an area of books which we know, but creating this print-on-demand model and setting up just-in-time warehouses so that the e-commerce industry, the e-retail industry, they can actually go forward and increase the base and make profitability, because today the losses are largely based on logistics, based on what we see. That's the first thing that one feels, that the opportunities which we are grasping. The second thing, Anita, you were mentioning about the divide, okay? Again, what we're working on is this product called Rappels. Based on what Nandan was talking about, the prices come down, where all the textbooks, okay, are going to be only on that tablet. And it's being tested in today, 10 schools are being tested out, where the costs for the textbooks as well as the tablets with multimedia content on it, so the learning outcomes are better, they are going to be lower than what a student spends in the full year on his textbooks. Now, keeping both of them in mind, I definitely, as you are talking, feeling that the opportunities are there, the opportunities are right, and it's something that now we are doing these two in retro, and it's tough, like what Atul said, the gestation period and so on, but we are seeing it happening in the near future.
And whether it's philanthropy or whether it's business. Have you, either of you, I'm sure you've got a number of experiences doing this. Can you tell us a couple of experiences, whether it's at a happiness level or a monetary level, or whichever way? I hope that wasn't a tough one.
No, no, the more money we give away, the richer we seem to be getting. So that's I guess, probably an example of what you said. But I think, I've found that
It's not necessarily money.
Yeah, no, I've found that, when I've been very generous with people, with ideas or friendships or whatever, that maybe several years later something happens which really sort of brings it back in a big way. So I think in general I believe that spreading wealth, spreading ideas is good, both the psychological endorsement kind of thing as well as a strategy.
Rohini, any examples?
So, when you go into some small place and see that, say, one of the simplest, most visceral joys for me is when I see a child reading one of our books. A child who would never have had a book like that, a colorful book. I've seen children, first time a child has been told this is your book, and she's not even reading it, she's just grasping it, that really, is this my book? This is mine, something for me. And many, I can give you hundreds of such very visceral connects. But there's also the other connect, like, say when you see a community, in a tribal area in Andhra Pradesh, we have helped, they had serious water pollution issues, and the government system doesn't reach there at all. It's a hilly tribal area, almost in Maoist country. Just helping, it's a simple thing that a person was helping, and we just supported him philanthropically and with a little bit of technological assistance. Today they've revived their own streams, they've created water filters, they've done this all themselves. Other people have started to come and learn from them. So just with a little bit of sympathy, how much impact today individuals can have on communities. It's just remarkable. Something that you do sitting here can have an impact somewhere else in the world. And that is a very special joy. Whereas Nandan said, it's not just about money, it's also about giving of yourself. And not trying to go, spread out. The number of people Nandan gives free advice to, I crib because that means that much less time with the family, but anybody, hundreds of people just come to him for advice. How many of them have come back later and said, you gave me something you said in 1983 or something, and I followed it and something happened. So it goes around and comes around. It definitely does. You have to have that faith. The more you give of yourself, honestly, the more happiness comes your way. But if you do it for that reason, it won't work out. That's the trick.
Okay, guys, we have time for a couple of more questions. And the only reason for that is that where's Harsha? He's hiding somewhere. Harsha is also here, and we've got some books. We managed to get a few books that that Nandan had written, and a few books that Rohini has written, and a few books that Harsha has written. So with all these eminent authors there, we thought that after the question and answer session, while we could have a few snacks, Sonia did say something about high tea. Nothing that's going to make us high here, but tea. So that is on the other side. So anyone after these couple of questions, we can proceed there. And some of you all who would like to get the book signed by these 3 eminent authors could feel to do that. Maybe in another 3 years, I would join in and sign a book also, but it'll take 3 years. So please, your question.
And I had in mind especially your idea of collaborative consumption and Creative Commons. And I'm just thinking, in the future, how important or how relevant will money be with these things coming in? Or what form will money take with bitcoins and things like that we have now? I don't even know if this is a relevant question of mine, but it's come up now. I wanted this question to answer you.
There's the regular money economy, and that's going to be there in a very big way. There's the barter economy. You already mentioned one barter economy that you mentioned. And then you're going to have all these cryptocurrencies like bitcoins, which will create a completely parallel system of currency. And as long as everybody trusts that currency system, then it will flourish. I mean, bitcoins have gone through some issues, but I think they are here to stay. And bitcoins will, this is the first generation of bitcoins. You're going to have more and more evolution in these so-called cryptocurrencies.
So will they manage to bypass the regulatory system, or?
They already are. I mean, you can trade in bitcoins. Nobody will know the difference.
No, it's a fascinating question. A lot of people are thinking about it. What is the future of money? And whether money as we know it today will actually continue to exist in 30, 40 years. So some of the work done by a friend of mine, if you're interested, called Rajni Bakshi here. And then there are of course a lot of books on called The Future of Money, which you might want to look at. But you will probably have the mainstream monetary economy and the whole money system going on. But a lot of people are doing many informal new trust networks, which are quite outside this money system.
The biggest transition in India will actually be from cash to digital economy, in the sense India's economy today is about 88% cash. So most business is done with cash. That once that goes, that itself will be a huge change. It's the same money, but digital money.
So how will they equate? How will this money equate with digital money?
No. What I meant was, instead of your cash being rupee notes in your hand, there'll be virtual money in your bank account or payment account or whatever. Like a bank account. But today the most trading is done with cash in India because we don't have the digital trust in the digital system. That will be the big change, and that will come very fast. Next 5-7 years, you'll see a lot of change.
But there are other systems like LETS, LETS, etc., where you get community credit. So you use money in a very different way. So there's some experiments that are quite interesting that are going on.
Okay, last.
Observation, really. What kind of work is happening in that space? And B, in your mind, what kind of strategic thinking? Because we are also doing a lot of work on water. So that's quite interesting for us.
We can take a bit of it offline if you like, but I think water is going to be one of the biggest challenges in India, probably the biggest in terms of even economic growth, because we have really ruined quite a bit of our water resources, polluted them, and made it impossible to use them. Our per capita consumption of water is significantly lowering just because finite water resources and obviously more people. We are reaching what is known as the stress threshold, and we expect to reach that in 10 or 15 years. So water is going to, and water is in everything, in every supply chain, in this wood, in this, and of course it's in this, unfortunately, but it's also in this, even though this looks solid, because water is a form of every manufacturing process. It's in our food, it's in our clothes, it's in our electronic devices. So there are many competing, conflicting demands for the same water in India. So you're going to see a lot, there are actually thousands of conflicts every day that we don't even know about that are taking place all over the country. I think we have to focus on smart use of water. Really, we cannot go the way of the West. We simply don't have the luxury of large water infrastructure, no matter what this government is saying. I think we'll have to innovate our way out of the potential water crisis. I think we have to think of cost-effective, decentralized, sensible solutions where constantly closing the loop using the principle of subsidiarity where you can close it. And I think that also has tremendous market opportunities, by the way, in embedded markets in water and wastewater especially. I think that's the future in water. You're going to have to conserve, you're going to have to protect from pollution, you're going to have to use innovative ways to use less water to deliver more output. There's no other way. We do not have sufficient water. Every time we all use water, we must remember that, because we have to innovate our way. We cannot follow existing models. There's not enough water for that.
Skills of the technology. I'm not against technology. You see, there's vehicle-to-vehicle communication, there is ETC, there are, now in Bangalore you were talking about, there are technologies where each truck owner can pay insurance according to the weight he's carrying instead of regular. Quite a few things. Volvo's Vision 2020, which is going to lead to zero fatalities. The only thing, as a layperson, I want to ask you is about the government peeping into our private lives. Now there are biometrics which every company, you have taken our retina imprints, there are fingerprints which the government has, and sorry to sound very blunt, but given the type of rulers we've had till now, it is scary. We were quite a few media professionals we were talking about. It's quite scary when the government sees where you're walking, when you pass out of a particular toll, and when you log onto the computer, which side did you go to, where did you pay. I believe that's very scary. How do we curtail or arrest that?
No, I think first of all, the most scary thing you have is your mobile phone. It's far scarier than any of the other things you mentioned, because the mobile phone, your conversations can be listened into, your messages can be read, and your location can be found in real time. Somebody knows that you're sitting here. So that is actually the scariest of the lot. Far more than biometrics, far more than trucks. So that on a real 24/7 it knows where you are. So I think we have to obviously build in safeguards, but this is a challenge everywhere in the world where the regulation always follows innovation. Innovators don't wait for rules, they go and innovate. And then societies try to catch up. And the global financial crisis of 2008 was an example of where regulation was way behind innovation. Similarly, what's happening today in the privacy debates about how much data that Google has or Amazon has is again because technology is far ahead of innovation. So I think societies will always have this tension between innovators running ahead and doing things and governments trying to figure out how to bring in safeguards so that it is not abused. And I think we are facing the same issue. But the question we are asking ourselves is the risk large enough that we stop innovation? That's really the question. And I don't think that's true. I think we cannot stop the innovation on the worry of of an aberration. We have to work harder to keep the innovation in pace, keep the regulation and laws in pace with the innovation.
And remember, the same superstructure that allows for surveillance also allows for supersurveillance. Means one actor from below can uncover all that using the same technology. So a Snowden or a WikiLeaks or something can destroy that whole command and control structure by using the very same technology against that structure. So both possibilities coexist, and this is up to all of us as citizens, to keep those values intact of how much privacy we need. And somebody else was saying, privacy is dead, forget about it. So just accept it.
Actually, the privacy given to private companies is far more dangerous. If you look at the 4 or 5 internet giants, Amazon, Google, Facebook, Apple and all these guys, they know incredible things about you without you even realizing what they know.
You want to end on that note, or you want to tell us something?
You want another question?
No. What I'm saying is,
Nandan's a great optimist, so he should end on a really optimistic future sort of scenario.
But all these things are solvable, don't worry.
Okay, that was a happy note. That was a happy note. So, yeah, thanks a lot.